It's free and it really helps our small team out. Okay, so you know how when you're texting someone for a while and it feels like everything's going great. You have some good chats, you click on most of the topics, and then bam, you decide to meet up for the first time in person. That's what happened with Sam and me. We had been talking for a few weeks. Nothing too heavy, just the usual stuff. Favorite movies, what we do for fun, food, music. You know, the basics. Sam seemed cool. Funny, relaxed, and a bit sarcastic, which I liked. We agreed to meet at this little Italian place downtown. Nothing too fancy, just a chill spot. When I walked in, I saw him right away. He was sitting at the table near the window, looking at his phone. I waved, and he looked up and smiled, standing up to greet me. We shook hands and sat down, and that's when things got a little off. At first, it wasn't anything major. We started talking about the menu, what we were gonna order. He was pretty friendly, cracking a couple of jokes. But something didn't feel right. He wasn't really looking at me when I was talking. He kept glancing around the room as if he was checking for something or someone. It wasn't just a casual look around. It was like he was scanning the whole place. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was just nervous. I mean, first dates, right? People get anxious. But then it started getting worse. I asked him a question about his job, something casual like, "What do you do for work?" He just stared at me for a second, his eyes kind of wide, and then gave this weird, vague answer about working in construction, but never really elaborated. I pressed him a little, thinking maybe he was just being shy, but he just kept avoiding details. As the night went on, it kept getting weirder. Every few minutes, he would glance over his shoulder like he was making sure no one was behind him. I couldn't help but notice it. I'd be in the middle of saying something, and he'd just look around, then act like he hadn't been distracted at all. His answers were short, and he kept checking his phone. I could see the messages popping up, but he wouldn't show me what they said. The weirdest part was when the waiter came over to check on us. Sam quickly said, "I'll take the check," like he was in a rush. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it felt off, like he just wanted to get out of there. We wrapped up the meal, and Sam suggested we go for a walk to digest the food. I thought that sounded fine, so we left. The night was chilly, but it wasn't anything too uncomfortable. As we walked, though, I noticed that he was still acting strange. We were walking along the sidewalk when he suddenly stopped, turned to face me, and said, "Want to see something cool?" He sounded a little too excited about it. Before I could even respond, he pulled me toward a parked car just up ahead. "It's nothing crazy, just check it out," he insisted. Now, I didn't want to seem rude, so I agreed, but the whole situation was starting to feel off. I walked toward the car with him, and when he opened the trunk, I froze. There was a mess inside the trunk. Stuff was piled up, old clothes, boxes, random papers, but there was something else too. At the top of the pile, there was a small beaten-up box, wrapped in string. It looked like it had been there for years. He saw the confusion on my face and smiled like nothing was wrong. This, oh, just some old stuff I don't need. Nothing weird about it. But the way he said it, so casually, made me uneasy. I don't know what it was, but something clicked in my brain that told me to leave. Fast, I told him I wasn't feeling great and made an excuse to head home. I didn't even stick around to hear what he said next. The walk back to my car was long and uncomfortable. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting Sam to pop up behind me. I didn't know what I was scared of. Maybe it was just my gut telling me that something wasn't right. The moment I got in my car and locked the doors, I felt like I could finally breathe. I pulled out of the parking lot and glanced in my rearview mirror. His car was still there, parked across the street from the restaurant, and his headlights were on like he was waiting for me to leave. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but I couldn't. When I got home, I was still thinking about that trunk. It was like a red flag that I couldn't ignore. I got out of the car and checked my phone. I had a couple of messages from Sam. Nothing crazy, just him asking if I made it home okay, which sure seemed normal. But something about it didn't sit right. I told myself I was overthinking it. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and settled in for the night. But even as I lay in bed, my thoughts kept drifting back to that weird encounter. I mean, what was in that trunk? And why had he been acting so strange? A few hours later, I went online and Googled his name, just a quick search. The first result that popped up wasn't about his job or anything normal. It was a police report about a guy with the same name who'd been arrested a few years back for suspicious activity near a shopping mall. The details were vague, but it made me feel sick to my stomach. I didn't text him back after that. In fact, I blocked his number. I didn't want to risk anything, but now I couldn't shake the thought that something about that night just wasn't right. What if I had stayed longer? What if I had let my guard down? So I met Mark through a mutual friend. We had been chatting for a few days and things were going pretty well. He seemed down to earth, funny, and easy to talk to. After a couple of days of texting, he suggested grabbing drinks at this low-key bar downtown. It was a Wednesday, so we knew it wouldn't be too busy. I figured it would be a chill, casual night. No expectations, just a good time. When I got to the bar, Mark was already there, sitting at a corner table. He stood up to greet me, and I could tell right away that he wasn't exactly how I pictured him. He was a little shorter than I thought, but honestly, I didn't mind. We started chatting, and it was easy to talk to him. We had similar tastes in music, movies, and even food, which I found surprising. We hit it off right away, and before I knew it, we'd been there for a couple of hours. The night was going well, but then Mark suggested something that made me hesitate. Hey, you want to come back to my place for a drink? It's not far. And I've got a pretty decent collection of whiskey, he said, hitting me a half smile. I didn't really know what to think. On one hand, I was enjoying the night, but on the other hand, it was a bit early to be heading back to his place. I guess I was also a little wary of the whole come back to my place thing. I wasn't expecting anything weird, but I had to admit I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea. But I figured why not? Worst case, I could leave whenever. I followed him to his car and we drove about 20 minutes outside the city. His house was located in a more suburban area, kind of isolated. The drive was a little longer than I expected, and I started to feel a little weird about it. But I pushed those feelings aside and kept telling myself I was overthinking it. When we finally got to his house, it looked older. The kind of house that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in a long time, with overgrown bushes and an unkempt lawn. Nothing alarming, but definitely not what I expected for someone who seemed pretty put together. Mark didn't seem bothered by it, though. He unlocked the door, and we stepped inside. Immediately, I felt something was off. The house was weirdly messy, like everything was just thrown around. There were clothes on the couch, random dishes piled up, and books scattered across the floor. It wasn't that it was filthy, but it had that feeling of a place someone had just moved into and hadn't gotten around to making it home. Still, I figured it was just a guy's house. Maybe he wasn't big on cleaning or organizing. It's not like I was expecting a five-star hotel or anything, but something about the vibe was unsettling. Mark led me through the cluttered living room and down a narrow hallway. At the end, there was a door that he stopped in front of. "I'll be right back," he said, then disappeared into the room, leaving me alone in the hallway. I figured he was just grabbing a bottle of whiskey or whatever, so I took a look around. That's when I noticed something strange. On the walls in the hallway were a series of photos. They weren't family photos or vacation pictures. They were just random snapshots of people. Some were of women I didn't recognize, others of men I'd never seen before. They were all pinned up, framed in no particular order. Some of the pictures were blurry, like they'd been taken from a distance, and others were just weird. I didn't know how to explain it, but something about them made me feel uncomfortable. I was still trying to figure out what was going on when Mark came back out. He didn't seem fazed by the fact that I was standing in the hallway, but he quickly ushered me into his room. The room was pretty basic, but there was something about it that felt off. The bed was unmade, clothes were strewn about, and the room just had this eerie feel to it. I sat on the edge of the bed, and Mark went over to his closet, pulling out a bottle of whiskey. He poured us both a drink, and we started talking again. But the conversation felt forced now. His answers were short, and I noticed he kept glancing at the door like he was waiting for something. Every time I asked him a question, he would either dodge it or give me a half-hearted response. I didn't know what it was, but something about him felt distant, almost like he was hiding something. I decided to look around the room more just to distract myself. That's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. A locked door at the far end of the room. It was odd because in a house that looked so disorganized, the door was neat and closed off. It felt like it didn't belong. I asked Mark about it, trying to play it cool, but he quickly changed the subject. "Oh, that's just a storage room," he said, but his tone was weird, like he was uncomfortable with the question. At that point, I didn't feel comfortable at all. I had to leave. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this house, more to Mark than he was letting on. I made an excuse, saying I had to get going, and left as quickly as I could. I didn't hear from him for a couple of days, but when I finally did, I decided to look him up online. That's when I found it. There was an old police report with his name in it, linked to a string of mysterious disappearances from the area where he lived. The details were vague, but I didn't need to know more. It all clicked. Something about that house, that locked door, the photos on the walls. It all made sense. I never texted him again. I still think about that night and wonder if I got out just in time. I met Desmond through the good old Tinder app. Yep, please don't judge. About a month ago. His profile was a mix of clever jokes and cute pictures of him at hiking spots. He seemed like a pretty chill guy. We hit it off instantly, chatting for hours about travel, food, and how we both loved a good laugh. After a while, we decided it was time to meet up in person, so we agreed to grab coffee at a cozy little cafe downtown. I'll admit I was a little nervous, but that's just how it goes when you meet someone for the first time. You want everything to go well, and it's always a little awkward. Still, Desmond's messages had been fun, and I had a good feeling about him. He seemed down to earth, so I was hopeful. When I got to the cafe, he was already there, sitting at a table near the window. He stood up to greet me, and I noticed he was even more handsome in person. Desmond had a warm smile, and I could tell he was nervous too. That made me feel better, like maybe we were both in this awkward boat together. We grabbed our drinks and started talking. At first, it was smooth sailing. We had a lot in common, and the conversation flowed easily. He made me laugh a couple of times, and I could tell that he was trying hard to be charming. He was the kind of guy who would crack a joke, laugh at himself, and make you feel at ease. But then, about 20 minutes into the date, things started to shift. Desmond suddenly looked uncomfortable. His face twisted a bit like he was trying to hold something back. At first, I thought maybe he just needed to adjust himself or something. Guys do that sometimes, right? I didn't want to make a big deal of it, but I could tell something was off. "Are you okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. He smiled, though it was strained. "Yeah, just, ah, give me a second. I'll be right back." I watched him stand up quickly, nearly knocking over his chair in the process. He rushed to the bathroom, and I tried to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe he had just eaten something that didn't sit well with him. It happens, right? About 10 minutes went by, and Desmond still hadn't returned. I began to wonder if he was okay. I checked my phone, wondering if he was going to text me or something, but there was nothing. I decided to give him a little more time. Then I saw him. Desmond was walking back towards the table, but he wasn't walking normally. His steps were stiff, and he had this look of panic on his face. I didn't know what to make of it. He seemed embarrassed, which only made me more concerned. "Desmond," I said, standing up to meet him halfway. He stopped in front of me and just stood there for a moment, looking like he was about to explode with anxiety. He opened his mouth to speak, but then he just froze. I didn't realize what was happening until he looked down at his pants. My eyes followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. It was, oh my God. Desmond had totally and completely pooped his pants. Like, not just a little fart or an accident, but full on solid, the whole thing. He looked like he was about to die of embarrassment right there in the cafe. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but the look on his face said it all. He shifted uncomfortably, his cheeks turning bright red. And I realized he didn't just poop his pants. He had absolutely no idea what to do about it. He muttered something under his breath, something about needing to go home, but I honestly couldn't understand him. It was clear that he was mortified. The awkwardness in the air was palpable, and I could feel it in my bones. My instinct was to run the other way. I mean, what else could you do in a situation like this? "Desmond, you need help." I asked, trying my best to not make him feel worse than he already did. But honestly, I wasn't sure what kind of help I could offer at that point. I didn't know if I should be sympathetic or just run for the hills. "I'm so sorry," he said, eyes wide with panic. I had to go to the bathroom, but it just happened. I didn't even know what to say. It wasn't like I could pretend nothing happened. This was as bad as it could get. He smelled like exactly what had just happened. "Okay," I said, trying to stay calm. Maybe you should go home and change." My words were awkward, and I couldn't help but feel a little bad for him. He clearly didn't want to be there anymore. The date was over, and it wasn't even his fault, sort of. "I'm so embarrassed. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me," he mumbled. eyes darting around the cafe like he expected someone to notice. At that point, I was just trying to figure out how to leave without it being more awkward. I honestly didn't even know how to leave him in this situation. He was stuck with a soiled pair of pants, and there was no easy way to handle it. I think you should go, I said softly, trying to be gentle. Maybe I'll text you later or something, but I think it's time to call it. He nodded, a grimace crossing his face. Yeah, you're probably right. I watched him awkwardly shuffle out of the cafe, holding his jacket up to his waist, trying to hide what had happened. My mind was racing with a mix of sympathy and absolute disbelief. What had just happened? The whole situation had me laughing at first, because honestly, what else was there to do? But when I got home later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Desmond and his unfortunate accident. It wasn't his fault, but I couldn't deny that I'd never experienced anything like that before on a date. I never heard from Desmond again. Maybe he was too embarrassed to reach out, or maybe he didn't want to relive that nightmare. I can't blame him. I certainly wasn't rushing to call him either. I mean, I felt bad, that kind of thing. That's not something to come back from. So yeah, I don't think I'll be doing any more coffee dates anytime soon. Especially now if I have to worry about someone pooping their pants halfway through. We had been chatting for a little while, and our conversations had been pretty easygoing. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a casual coffee meetup at this cute little cafe near the university. I arrived a little early and grabbed a table by the window, enjoying the sunny afternoon and the bustle of people coming and going. Jake showed up right on time, and I was surprised at how tall he was in person. He had this quiet, calm presence about him, which was a little refreshing. He waved, I waved back, and he slid into the seat across from me. I smiled, trying to break the ice with a casual greeting. But as the conversation started, I quickly realized that something was off. Jake wasn't exactly bad at talking, but he was a man of very few words. At first, I thought maybe he was just shy or nervous. I asked him what he liked to do for fun, and he just shrugged. I tried again on something lighter, like asking about his favorite movies. He answered with a simple, "I don't really watch movies," and went quiet again. I didn't want to be the only one talking, so I kept asking questions. What kind of music he liked, what he did for work, what he thought about the latest tech trends, but each response was brief and vague. He didn't seem particularly excited about any of the topics, just kind of indifferent. I found myself talking more and more, trying to fill the awkward silence that kept hanging between us. But the more I tried to engage him, the more I realized that something was wrong. Jake wasn't really there in the conversation. He wasn't responding with any real enthusiasm or interest. It was like he was just going through the motions. I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things. But then, after about 20 minutes, something even stranger happened. I checked the time on my phone, and it had stopped, completely frozen at 2:13 p.m. I checked my screen again, pressing a few buttons to reset it, but nothing happened. That's when Jake finally looked up from his coffee. "Oh, it's like that, huh?" he said, his voice calm but kind of eerie. I was taken aback, trying to figure out what he meant. "What do you mean?" Jake just nodded toward my phone and said, "The place has bad energy. Weird things happen here." It was so random, so out of nowhere that I didn't know how to respond. I laughed a little awkwardly, trying to brush it off. Bad energy, huh? I didn't really feel that, but Jake didn't laugh. He just stared at me, his eyes not leaving mine, like he was waiting for me to understand something. I felt my chest tighten a little as I shifted in my seat. His gaze was intense, and the way he said it didn't sound like a joke at all. He was serious. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to seem rude. I looked around the cafe, trying to distract myself, and that's when I realized something even stranger. Every single person in the cafe seemed to be doing the exact same thing. No one was talking. Everyone had their phones out, staring at their screens without saying a word. It felt like the whole place was in a trance. I started to feel a bit claustrophobic, but I tried to stay calm. I glanced back at Jake, and he was still looking at me, his expression completely unreadable. His eyes had this intense, almost unsettling focus that made me feel like I was being analyzed, studied. I finally broke the silence and asked him if he was okay, trying to get him to engage in something more personal. "You've been staring at me for a while now," I said lightly, hoping to steer the conversation back to something normal. Jake didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly. "I'm just trying to figure you out," he said, his voice still eerily calm. "You're different." I wasn't sure if I should be offended or confused, but before I could respond, he stood up without saying anything else and went over to the counter to get refills on our drinks. I sat there, my mind racing. Something didn't feel right. I was starting to wonder if maybe I should leave. I checked my phone again, and it still hadn't budged from 2:13. It was almost like time itself had frozen. I started to feel the weight of the atmosphere in the cafe press down on me. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the whole situation felt too weird. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. When Jake returned with the drinks, I tried to make small talk again, but it was clear he wasn't really interested. Every word I said seemed to pass right through him, like he wasn't even listening. He wasn't engaging, not really. He just nodded or gave one-word responses, and it made me more and more uncomfortable. At one point, I checked my phone again, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The time was still stuck at 2:13 p.m. That was when I knew I had to get out of there. I didn't care about finishing the coffee or the awkward date. My phone had been glitching the whole time. The atmosphere was weird, and I was starting to feel like I was trapped in some kind of, I don't even know what, but it wasn't normal. I stood up quickly, putting my jacket on and grabbing my bag. I think I'm going to head out, I said, trying to make it sound casual. Jake didn't respond. He just kept sitting there, staring at me without a word, his gaze following me as I walked toward the door. The weird thing was, it didn't even feel like he was watching me. He was just observing me like I was some kind of object, something to be analyzed. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the street, taking a deep breath. As I looked back at the cafe, Jake was still sitting by the window staring at me. His eyes never left me, even as I walked down the street. I didn't know what it was, whether it was just a weird vibe or something deeper, but I knew I wasn't going back there again. I had been chatting with Lily for about a week. She was one of those people who seemed to click with me instantly. Our conversations flowed naturally, and we quickly found common ground. We both loved indie movies, hiking, and pizza. Typical stuff, but it was nice to find someone who had similar tastes. After texting back and forth, we decided to meet for a drink at a bar downtown. I wasn't expecting fireworks or anything, but I thought it would be fun. When I showed up, Lily was already there, sitting at the bar, looking casual in a sweater and jeans. She waved when she saw me, and I walked over to greet her. The first few minutes were pretty easygoing, normal in fact. We had a drink, chatted about our work, and jumped around a bit. She was really easy to talk to, and I didn't think much of it. But as the night wore on, things started to feel a little off. Lily was friendly, maybe a little too friendly. It wasn't that she was overbearing, but there was this energy about her that felt intense. She was always asking questions about my day, my plans for the weekend, my favorite things. It wasn't bad at first, but after a while, I started to feel like she was digging deeper than necessary. It wasn't just casual curiosity, it was almost like she was trying to get a very specific answer. After we finished our drinks, I figured the night was winding down. I was ready to head home, but Lily suggested we go for a walk in the park nearby. I didn't really feel like it, but I didn't want to seem rude, so I agreed. We strolled along the path, still chatting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She seemed a little too interested in where I lived, who my friends were, and what I did when I wasn't working. By the time we parted ways, I had a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. It was just a feeling of being watched, or like I wasn't quite in control of the conversation. I went home, figuring I was just overthinking things. Maybe she was just a little more intense than I was used to. I sent her a message when I got home, thanking her for a nice time. She responded almost immediately, saying how much she enjoyed the evening and how she couldn't wait to see me again. I smiled at my phone, thinking, okay, maybe I'm just being paranoid. But the next message she sent made my stomach drop. It was late, probably around midnight, when I got the text. I'm parked across the street from your apartment building. At first, I thought it was a joke. I replied, asking what she meant. I didn't even think she would be serious, but then she sent a photo of my apartment building. I felt a chill run down my spine. My heart skipped a beat as I looked out the window. Sure enough, I saw her car parked across the street, right by the curb. I stood there frozen for a moment, staring at the car. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. What was she doing here? I hadn't invited her, and it didn't make any sense. I quickly texted her back, "Why are you here? It's late, you should head home." Her reply came almost immediately, "Just wanted to make sure you got home safe." I was a little creeped out, but I didn't want to overreact. I figured maybe it was just her way of being sweet or protective, but it was still strange. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to seem rude. So I just sent her a quick thanks for checking in, but I'm fine. She didn't leave, though. She stayed there, sitting in her car across the street for what felt like forever. I tried to ignore it, but every time I glanced out the window, I could see her car parked there, headlights off, just sitting in the dark. It wasn't normal. I couldn't figure out why she would be doing this, why she would go to such lengths just to make sure I was okay. Eventually, I decided to go to bed, hoping that maybe by the morning she'd be gone. But when I woke up the next day, I found something under my door, a note written in neat handwriting with just a few words. See you soon. My heart dropped into my stomach. What the hell? The note was strange, and the way she had been parked across the street like that, it didn't sit right with me. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Lely had crossed a line. I thought about texting her to let her know I wasn't comfortable with what happened, but honestly, I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to sound paranoid or crazy, but I was genuinely freaked out. I couldn't stop thinking about how she had parked outside my place late at night watching me, and how she had left that cryptic note under my door. I didn't want to be mean or confrontational, so I didn't text her back at all. I figured it would be easier to just move on. I didn't want to see her again, and I definitely didn't want to encourage any more weird behavior. A few days went by and I didn't hear from her. I thought maybe I had dodged a bullet, but then, out of the blue, I got another message from her. It was short. I'm thinking about you. Let me know when you're free. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. At that point, I realized that Lily wasn't just someone who was looking for a casual date or a good time. She was something else. Something much, much more intense. I never replied, and I haven't heard from her since. I've been chatting with Brian for a few weeks before we finally agreed to meet up in person. We had some good conversations, nothing too intense, but enough to keep things interesting. He was funny, easygoing, and seemed like someone I get along with. He suggested we meet at a local park for a relaxed afternoon, so I figured it would be a nice, low-pressure way to get to know each other. I arrived at the park a little early, hoping to get a good spot to sit. It was a nice, sunny Saturday, and there were a few people scattered around, walking their dogs, sitting on benches, or jogging along the path. I found a bench near a small pond and sat down, waiting for Brian to show up. I checked my phone. No messages from him yet, but I wasn't worried. He'd mentioned he might be running a little late, so I just kicked back and relaxed while I waited. A few minutes later, I saw him walking toward me. He waved, and I waved back, standing up to greet him. He was just as I remembered from his pictures, tall, with shaggy brown hair and a relaxed, confident demeanor. We said our hellos, and I suggested we take a walk around the park to chat. He agreed, and we started walking along the path, chatting about this and that, nothing too heavy, just a light conversation about our interests and the weather. It was nice. Nothing seemed out of place. We walked for a while, and at some point, Brian suggested we find a more secluded spot in the park to sit down. I wasn't too keen on the idea. Something about it felt off, but I shrugged it off. We walked a bit farther from the main path until we reached a quiet area surrounded by trees. There was a bench nestled in the shade, and I sat down feeling the cool breeze. It felt peaceful, but also a little isolating, like we were far away from the rest of the park. I didn't really mind at first, though. It was a nice change of pace from the crowds. Brian wandered off to take a phone call. I didn't think much of it. People take calls all the time, right? But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel a little uncomfortable. It was unusual for him to be gone so long, and I couldn't help but glance around, trying to figure out where he went. I didn't hear him coming back. I checked my watch. 15 minutes had passed, and I still hadn't heard him return. I started to feel a little uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he had gone to the bathroom or stepped aside for a private conversation. He probably didn't want to disturb me. But then the unease started to grow. Another 10 minutes passed. I was starting to get nervous. Where the hell was he? I stood up and walked a little further into the park, calling out his name quietly. No response. I walked toward the nearby restroom area, but he wasn't there either. I checked my phone again. Still no messages from him. I tried to stay calm, telling myself he was just taking a little longer than expected, but it was starting to feel like something wasn't right. I started to look around more carefully, trying to find any sign of him. I had no idea where he had gone. I walked back to the bench where we had sat, hoping to find him there, but no sign of Brian. I took out my phone and texted him, asking if he was okay. But when I tried to send a message, it wouldn't go through. My phone showed an error message. I tried again. Same thing, no signal. Now I was really starting to get worried. I couldn't figure out why my messages weren't going through. Was there something wrong with the area, or was it just my phone? Either way, it didn't seem normal. I stood there for a few minutes, my mind racing. Was he playing some kind of prank on me? Did he have an emergency? I tried calling him, but the call wouldn't go through either. It was like he had disappeared completely. At this point, I was starting to feel a bit panicked. I didn't know what to do. I went to the park's entrance, hoping to see him walking around, but he wasn't anywhere in sight. I looked back at the area where we had been sitting, trying to figure out if I had missed something. Maybe he had gone back to his car, or maybe I had been too distracted to notice when he left. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to stay calm, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I knew it wasn't like him to just disappear without saying a word, especially after we had been chatting for so long. And then it hit me, what if something had happened to him? I started walking back toward the park's main entrance, looking around at the people still walking by, but I couldn't see anyone who looked like Brian. My thoughts kept spiraling. What if he was hurt or in trouble? What if something had happened to him while he was taking that phone call? I had no idea where to even begin searching, so I decided to leave the park and head home. I tried texting him again, still no response. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a message or a missed call, but nothing. Later that evening, I got a strange notification on my phone. It was a news alert, something about people disappearing from the park, but it didn't say much more than that. It was odd, but I brushed it off as coincidence. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Brian. It didn't make sense. He had just vanished. I kept wondering if I had missed something, if I could have done something differently, but it was all so strange. I never heard from him again, and the weirdest part was that when I searched online, I found reports of other people vanishing from that same park, but there were no answers as to why. I don't know what happened to Brian, but I haven't been back to that park since. I should have known something was off the moment Ethan suggested the date. I mean, who the hell suggests meeting in the middle of nowhere at an abandoned house for a first date? But I thought it was cool, a little adventurous even. I don't know why I didn't trust my gut. I mean, all I knew about Ethan was what we talked about in the app. And yeah, he seemed fun enough. But when you think about it, who even chooses a place like that? Still, I went for it. We agreed to meet up at a coffee shop first, just to chat a bit, get to know each other, so that's what we did. I was already feeling a little weird because he showed up wearing this old jacket, like one you'd see in a thrift store. It wasn't like it was bad, just kind of strange, especially for a date. But whatever, I wasn't gonna judge. We grabbed a couple of drinks and sat by the window, and things went well at first. Ethan had this laid back vibe about him, made jokes about his job. He worked in tech, I think, and talked a bit about his travels, which was pretty cool. But there was something in his eyes, this glint like he was excited about something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I should have asked myself why a first date would involve meeting at some rundown place. Eventually, after we finished our drinks, he suggested we take a drive to a cool spot he knew of. And the whole time, I'm still wondering why we're not just doing something normal, like a walk in a park. But again, I brushed it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. We hop in his car and we drive for a while, farther than I thought we would go. The area gets sketchier and sketchier. We pass through this quiet neighborhood and keep driving into the woods, and then we pull up to this place. It wasn't a house, it was a ghost of a house. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, like some horror movie scene. The windows were all boarded up, the paint was peeling, the front porch sagging like it might collapse if anyone stepped on it. I'm standing there staring at it, trying to figure out if I'm even in the right place. But Ethan's already out of the car, grinning like a kid who's about to show me something awesome. Come on, he says, like he's inviting me into a hidden treasure. It's cool, trust me. I stood there for a second, my gut telling me to leave, but I didn't. Stupid. I followed him inside, my footsteps echoing on the wood floor as we crept through the front door. The place was dark, way darker than I thought it would be, but Ethan had his phone out, using it as a flashlight, leading the way. The air felt heavy, almost stale, and the floor creaked like something was about to break. I wasn't sure if it was just the house or my anxiety starting to get the best of me, but I wasn't feeling it. Ethan, though, was on a different level. He was too excited. He kept talking about how he found this place a couple of weeks ago and how it was the perfect place to escape, to just be. I didn't get it. Who would want to hang out in a place like this? But he seemed so happy. I could tell he was into something more than just me, like maybe the house was more important to him than I was. We walked down the hallway and there were these weird symbols scratched into the walls. Some of them didn't even make sense, and I could tell Ethan wasn't bothered by any of it. At some point, I asked him if we should leave, but he waked it off, all casual, saying something like, "It's fine. It's just old stuff." But it wasn't just old stuff. The place had this creepy vibe, like I was being watched, even though it was just the two of us. I don't know how long we were inside, maybe 20 minutes or so, but it felt like way more. Then things took a turn. Ethan started acting a little strange. He was quieter, moving faster, his voice lower. He'd look around like he was waiting for something. I kept thinking that this is not normal. My heart started to race. I remember hearing a noise from upstairs, something that sounded like footsteps. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Ethan didn't even flinch. "It's probably just the house settling," he said, brushing it off. But I knew better. It was more than that. Something wasn't right. I decided to head for the door, but as I turned around to leave, Ethan grabbed my arm. I pulled back, confused, but he had this weird grin on his face. He told me we had to see the upstairs room, that it was worth it, that I'd regret it if I didn't see it. My stomach turned. I tried to pull away, but he wasn't letting go. I was done. I didn't care what was upstairs. I needed out. Finally, I broke free and bolted toward the door. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the handle, trying to escape. Ethan didn't follow me immediately, but when I stepped outside, I saw him standing in the doorway, watching me. His face was different now, like a switch had flipped. There was no excitement, just this cold, weird stare. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I ran to the car, started it up, and didn't stop until I was on my way back to my apartment. I didn't hear from Ethan after that, which honestly was probably for the best. But I still think about that night, about how I walked into a place I didn't belong, and how easily things could have gone south if I hadn't listened to that nagging voice in my head. I'll never forget the first time I met Nayeli. We'd been talking for a few weeks on this app, and I was honestly excited to meet her. She seemed pretty cool, funny, down to earth, a little quirky. We even had a bunch in common. So when she suggested we meet up at a coffee shop downtown, I thought, yeah, this could be good. A nice, chill first date. We agreed to meet at this cute little cafe near the park. It was one of those places that always had a bunch of people sitting outside with their laptops or reading books, sipping on overpriced lattes. Perfect for a first date, right? When I walked in, I spotted her right away. She was sitting by the window, smiling, looking just like her pictures. I waved, she waved back, and everything seemed, well, normal. At first it was. We talked about the usual stuff, what we did for work, our favorite movies, things we like to do for fun. She was really easy to talk to. But after a little while, something started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I noticed she was staring at me a little too much, like almost analyzing me. It wasn't uncomfortable at first, but after a while, it started to get weird. Then she dropped a bomb. She asked me about a conversation we had last week. I was completely lost. I didn't remember anything like that. She told me we'd talk about a road trip I had taken and how I told her I was planning another one. But I never mentioned a road trip, not even once. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about, and she laughed it off. "Oh, maybe I got confused, sorry," she said, like it was no big deal. I let it go, but in the back of my mind, I started thinking, did I mention a trip? Did I forget? As the night went on, the conversation started getting even weirder. She kept making these odd comments about things I should have remembered, things I'd supposedly said to her in our texts. I didn't remember saying half of the stuff she was talking about. It was starting to feel like she was playing some sort of game with me, but I couldn't figure out why. I was starting to feel dizzy, like I was losing track of reality. When she asked about my exes, I was hesitant, but I told her a little bit. Nothing too personal, just the usual. But then she said, "Oh, I remember you told me your ex was into hiking and you guys went on these long trips together. That's so cute." I stopped dead. I had never told her that. In fact, I hadn't even been hiking in years. I could feel my chest tighten. I don't think I said that, I said. But she was already dismissing me, like I was the one who had forgotten. "Yeah, sorry," she said with a smile. I must have misunderstood. That's when things started to get bad. It was like she was slowly trying to make me feel crazy. She started correcting me on little things, stuff I was sure I remembered correctly. The more she did it, the more I started to doubt myself. I'd tell her about a funny thing that happened at work, and she'd say, No, no, you said it was the opposite, remember? And I'd be like, I don't remember saying that, but she'd just brush me off and laugh it off like it was no big deal. It wasn't just a few small mistakes. She was insisting on things that didn't make sense. At one point, she even said, "We talked about meeting up at the lake, didn't we? You mentioned it last time." I had never said anything about meeting her at a lake, let alone making plans to go. I told her that, but she gave me this look like I was being ridiculous. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Because I remember clearly. You told me you loved going there, and I said I'd love to come with you sometime." By this point, my head was spinning. It was like I was living in some alternate reality where nothing made sense. I was starting to question myself. Did I say those things? Did I forget things? Was I losing it? She made me feel like I was going crazy, and I hated that feeling. But it didn't stop there. After the third or fourth time she made these strange comments, I started getting this eerie feeling like I was part of some twisted game. She kept pushing things, making it feel like I was missing pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed. When I went to pay the bill, I realized something else was off. My wallet was gone. I had definitely put it in my jacket pocket when I got to the cafe, but it was nowhere to be found now. I checked all my pockets, my bag, but nothing. I tried to stay calm. I even went up to the cashier to ask if they'd seen it, but no luck. Natalie seemed totally unfazed, like it was no big deal. She suggested maybe I'd left it in my car. I didn't want to make a scene, but I was starting to panic. She just sat there, sipping her coffee, smiling like everything was fine. I told her I'd walk outside to check my car, but as soon as I stepped out, I looked around and saw a group of people standing near the entrance of the cafe. They weren't even looking at me, but one of them had a strange smile on their face. It made my skin crawl. I went back inside, got my stuff, and left without saying another word. The whole way home, I kept replaying everything in my head, but I couldn't make sense of it. Did she have something to do with my wallet going missing? Was she messing with me on purpose? I'll never know, but I haven't talked to her since that night, and I don't think I ever will. I don't even trust my own memories anymore. I met Chris through a dating app, and from the start, I thought we hit it off. Our conversations flowed easily, lots of jokes, casual chats about life, our favorite shows, and music. He seemed super down to earth and honestly kind of hot. So when he suggested we meet up at a bar downtown, I thought it was a great idea. I had nothing to lose, right? I had been to the bar before. It was one of those dimly lit, trendy spots with craft cocktails and a laid back vibe. The kind of place where everyone's too cool for school but still friendly. I was a little nervous, but I brushed it off. Meeting someone for the first time is always a bit awkward, but that's normal, right? When I walked in, I spotted him right away. Chris was sitting at the bar, looking relaxed, leaning back a little too far, like he was trying to look confident or something. He waved when he saw me and gave me that smile that made his eyes light up. We exchanged some small talk about how the bar had a new drink menu, and he even recommended a cocktail he liked. Things were fine, normal first date stuff. But then, about halfway through our drinks, I noticed something. There was a guy across the bar who kept looking at me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I caught him again staring in my direction. It was weird. I tried to brush it off and focus on Chris, but the guy didn't stop looking at me. Every time I turned to look around, there he was, his eyes locked onto me. Chris must have noticed me getting a little uncomfortable because he made a joke about how maybe the guy thought I was cute. I half laughed, half pretended to be amused, but it didn't feel like a harmless glance. This guy wasn't just glancing over. He was staring, and the longer it went on, the more I could feel my skin crawling. I tried not to make a big deal of it. I didn't want to ruin the night. But when I went to the bathroom, I noticed the guy had followed me. As I was walking back, I saw him standing at the edge of the bar, still staring. And when I got back to the table, Chris didn't seem to care. He didn't even notice the guy. I started getting this weird vibe, like maybe Chris didn't care because he knew the guy. At one point, the guy came over to the table. He didn't look too out of place just wearing a hoodie, but there was something about him that felt off. He said something to Chris, I couldn't hear what, but I caught their little exchange. The way they were talking seemed way too familiar, like they'd known each other for a while. I didn't know what to think. Chris didn't introduce me, just acted like it was no big deal, and the guy smiled at me like he knew me. I didn't know if I should say something or just leave. Chris was still acting normal, but now I was on edge. Why hadn't he introduced the guy? It felt like something was off, but I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to look paranoid. The guy stayed for a while, just standing there, chatting with Chris. They were laughing, but there was a weird undertone to it. I couldn't tell if they were talking about me or something else. I felt like I was intruding on some private moment that had nothing to do with me. The vibe was off, and I was starting to feel really uncomfortable. When the guy left, he gave me a weird look. Like, not a friendly glance, but something that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. It was like the whole situation had shifted from casual to creepy. Chris didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. He just ordered another round and kept talking like nothing had happened. After a while, I started feeling like I was the one who was out of place. I started noticing little things. Chris was texting someone constantly. He kept looking at his phone, then back at me, then texting again. It wasn't a big deal, but it made me uneasy. I mean, we were supposed to be getting to know each other, not playing second fiddle to his phone. I tried to ignore it, but when I stood up to go to the bathroom again, I realized something. The guy who had been staring at me was outside, standing by the window looking directly at me. I froze. I was too far from the door to run. I don't know what came over me, but I just felt like I needed to leave. I had no idea what was going on, but something wasn't right. I went back to the table, and before I could say anything, Chris suggested we leave. It felt like a relief at first, like he was finally picking up on my discomfort, but then I noticed something weird. The guy was outside, waiting by the door as if he was waiting for us. I didn't know how to handle it. We walked out, and I kept my distance from Chris, just watching the guy. I couldn't help myself. I had to know if he was following us, and sure enough, when we turned the corner, I saw him. He was walking behind us at a distance, but it was clear he was following us. I started to panic, but I didn't want to make a scene. I tried to act like everything was normal, but every time I looked back, the guy was still there. I turned to Chris, finally, and asked him, "Who was that guy? Why is he following us?" Chris just smiled and said, "Oh, it's just a friend. No big deal." A friend? Then why the hell didn't he introduce him to me? And why did I feel like I was being watched the whole night? We kept walking, but at that point, I was already freaked out. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew I wasn't about to stick around to find out. As we got in my car, I told Chris I was going home. I wasn't rude, but I was done. The next few days, I kept thinking about it. I kept looking over my shoulder when I was out. And while I never heard from Chris again after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the guy wasn't just some random friend of his. I still don't know what really happened that night, but I don't think I'll ever be able to forget how everything felt off. I met Jake online about a month ago, and we hit it off pretty quickly. We texted nonstop, swapped playlists, recommended books, and even made fun of each other's terrible movie tastes. After a few weeks of talking, he suggested we meet in person. He seemed like a genuinely cool guy, so I agreed. He suggested we go for a walk in the park at midnight since we both liked the peace and quiet. I'll admit it was a little unusual, but we talked so much that I didn't think twice about it. I was definitely nervous, though. It was my first time meeting someone from a dating app, and the whole midnight thing felt a bit off. But I trusted him, and after all the chats, I thought, how bad could it be? We met at the park's entrance, and at first, everything seemed totally fine. The night was calm, and the air had a cool crispness to it. Jake was just as I remembered from his pictures, tall, a little scruffy, with a relaxed vibe. We started walking, chatting about random things, and it felt almost like we'd known each other for ages. I felt myself starting to relax. But then, as we walked deeper into the park, things started to feel weird. We turned onto a less traveled path that led to a secluded area. There weren't any other people around, and the trees grew so thick that the moon barely reached the ground. It was dead quiet, a kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Jake suddenly stopped walking. He stood there, staring out into the dark like he was listening for something. "Jake, you okay?" I asked, a bit concerned. He didn't respond at first, just stood there for a while, his head tilted as if he was hearing something I couldn't. After a long pause, he looked at me, his eyes wide, and said, "I think I hear voices. Do you hear them?" I didn't hear anything, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. "No, I don't," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. "Maybe it's just the wind or your imagination." Jake nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Then, without warning, he pulled out his phone and started filming me. He turned the camera toward me, holding it up in front of my face. "Wait, what are you doing?" I asked, a little confused. "Just act natural," he said, his voice casual but a little too focused. I thought he was joking at first. Maybe it was some weird, quirky thing he was doing to lighten the mood. But then he didn't stop filming. He kept the camera on me, following my every movement. I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe he was just being strange for the camera, but it didn't feel like a joke anymore. Jake, what's going on? I asked, my stomach starting to turn. Why are you filming me? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he started asking me questions I hadn't shared with him at all. Personal stuff. Stuff about my family, my childhood, my fears. Things that were way too deep for a first date. How do you feel about your parents? Are you close with them? He asked, his eyes glued to the phone screen. I felt my heart start to race. Jake, how do you know about my parents? He ignored my question and kept filming. Do you have any recurring dreams? Any weird experiences with your exes? I felt my skin crawl. This wasn't normal. I hadn't told him anything about my exes, and yet here he was, asking all these intimate questions like he already knew the answers. I felt like I was losing control of the situation, and I didn't know how to get out of it. I tried to take a step back, but he moved with me blocking my way. Jake, stop, I said, my voice shaking. What the hell is going on? Why are you doing this? He didn't stop filming. Instead, he just smiled, a smile that was so cold and calculated, it sent a chill down my spine. I'm not done yet, he said, his voice low and unsettling. I just need to get a little more information. You'll understand soon. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. He was blocking the path back, his body language rigid and unyielding. This wasn't a date. This was something else. I didn't know if I was in danger or if he was just some creepy guy with too much time on his hands, but I knew I had to get out of there. I tried again to walk away, but he stepped in front of me. You can't leave yet, he said, his voice almost hypnotic. I need you to answer a few more questions. I looked around desperately. There was no one in sight. The park was eerily quiet, and the trees felt like they were closing in on me. I couldn't believe this was happening. I thought I was safe. I thought I had done everything right. I pushed past him, but he grabbed my arm. I just need one more thing, he said. Please, just one more thing. In a panic, I yanked my arm free and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't even know if he was following me. I just ran, heart racing, until I reached the entrance of the park, where I finally found a couple walking their dog. I didn't stop running until I was safely back at my car, and I didn't care if Jake was still watching me from the trees. I called my best friend as I drove away, trying to calm my nerves. Jake texted me a few hours later, asking if I was okay and apologizing for being weird. He said he just got carried away and that I shouldn't take it personally. But I knew that wasn't the case. I didn't respond. I haven't heard from him since, but I still get that sinking feeling in my stomach when I think about what happened. I never should have trusted him, and I'll never take a midnight walk with a stranger again. We decided to meet up for dinner at a small Italian restaurant I knew. The date went well, great food and a fun conversation, a little flirting here and there, all the things you'd expect from a first date. But the weirdness started when Sarah offered to drive me home. I wasn't going to say no. She was sweet, and I didn't have any real reason to be concerned. I assumed the night was winding down, and I figured I could catch a ride with her since my place wasn't far from the restaurant. The car ride started normal enough. She was talking about how much she loved her new apartment and how she'd recently gotten a promotion at work. Everything seemed fine, until she took a sudden left turn. I looked out the window, thinking she was just taking a detour, but when I glanced over at her, I noticed her grip on the wheel was tense, her knuckles white. She didn't look at me, just kept driving with this odd, almost frantic focus. Hey, this isn't the way to my place, I said, a little confused. Are you sure you're going the right way? She gave me a quick glance, her lips curling into a tight smile. Oh, I know a shortcut. It's faster. I didn't want to make things awkward, so I just nodded, though something about it didn't sit right with me. I glanced out the window again, but the streetlights were starting to fade away, and the houses seemed fewer and farther between. I was starting to get that feeling in the pit of my stomach, like maybe I should have been paying closer attention to the route. As we kept driving, she started talking more and more about her past, her exes, her childhood, her experiences growing up in a small town. The more she spoke, the more intense her tone became. She seemed to be almost obsessed with talking about her exes, how they'd never understood her, how they never treated her right. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded along. But the way she spoke felt like it was coming from a dark place, like she was trying to make me feel sorry for her or understand her pain. It was starting to get uncomfortable. I tried to change the subject, but she wasn't having it. She started telling me about her last boyfriend, how he ruined her, and how she'd never let anyone get that close to her again. Her voice was low now, almost whispering, like she was sharing some deep, dark secret. It felt like a warning, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly felt so off. I started looking around more, trying to make sense of where we were. The familiar buildings had disappeared, and we were now on a deserted road with no streetlights, surrounded by trees and open fields. There were no houses in sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Sarah," I said, my voice a little shaky now, "are you sure this is the right way? I don't recognize this road at all." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she kept talking about how her exes didn't respect her and how they always left her feeling empty. The more she spoke, the more intense she got. It was like she was lost in some kind of conversation that only she was a part of, and I was just stuck listening to her. I could feel the tension building. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew something wasn't right. I felt trapped. I tried to ask her to stop the car and let me out, but she didn't respond. She just kept driving like she didn't hear me. The road was getting even more isolated, and now there were no cars around us at all. The only sound was the hum of the engine. Finally, after what felt like forever, she stopped the car. We were in the middle of nowhere. No houses, no streetlights, nothing. Just a dark, open road. My stomach dropped. "Sarah," I said, my voice more urgent now, "please, can we go back? This isn't funny anymore. I really don't feel safe." She turned to look at me, and her smile had faded. Her eyes were wide, intense. "We're almost there," she said, but it didn't feel reassuring. It felt like she was forcing me into something. I felt a wave of panic hit me. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I turned to her. "Sarah, let me out of the car now," I demanded, my voice shaking. "I don't want to be here." She just stared at me, almost like she was studying me. It was like a switch had flipped, and now she wasn't the sweet, kind girl I had met just a few hours ago. She was someone else. Someone I didn't recognize, someone I was starting to fear. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, and I could hear my breath coming faster. I was panicking, and I wasn't sure how to get out of this situation. I tried the door again, but it was still locked. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she looked at me, her eyes softening just a little. "I'm sorry," she said, almost like she was waking up from some kind of trance. I don't know what came over me. I just wanted to talk to you. I needed to explain. I didn't wait for another word. I quickly unlocked the door and jumped out of the car, running as fast as I could. I didn't even look back. My heart was pounding in my chest as I ran through the dark, not sure what was happening, but needing to get away. I eventually found a gas station a few miles down the road and called a cab. I never looked back, and I never spoke to Sarah again. The whole thing still feels like a nightmare I can't quite shake. She was never violent. The way she acted, the way she tried to trap me in her conversation, in that car, was terrifying. I don't know what her deal was, but I'm never taking a ride from anyone like that again. Everything about him seemed perfect. His photos were cool, his profile was funny, and we hit it off immediately. We texted constantly for weeks, talking about everything from movies to obscure hobbies. Eventually, we decided to meet for a drink at this trendy new bar that had just opened up. I was excited but nervous. This was my first date in a while, and I really liked him so far. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a table in the back, a cold beer in front of him. He was just as cute as his pictures, maybe even more so in person. The conversation flowed easily, just like a head over text, and we laughed a lot. It felt like one of those nights where everything falls into place. We even talked about doing something fun after the bar, like hitting a local arcade or just grabbing some late night food. But then, around the middle of the night, I started to notice something strange. Ryan was acting a little distant. It wasn't anything obvious, but he kept checking his phone, glancing at it like he was waiting for something. He'd excuse himself to take calls, long ones, like 10-minute conversations, each one more cryptic than the last. At first, I thought it was just work stuff, but then I started to get this weird feeling. The way he looked at his phone, the way he reacted to whatever was being said on the other end, it didn't feel like business at all. There was an uneasiness to his movements. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just overthinking. But then, As if on cue, a man walked into the bar and came straight toward our table. He smiled when he saw Ryan, and Ryan's whole demeanor changed in an instant. He went from relaxed and happy to stiff and uncomfortable, like he was being put on the spot. The man reached out and shook Ryan's hand, and they exchanged a few words I couldn't quite make out. But the moment the guy sat down, everything about Ryan's vibe shifted again. He was on edge, barely speaking, and the man didn't help. He started asking me weird questions. Nothing too crazy, but often enough to make me uncomfortable. "Do you come here often?" he asked, eyeing me with a look that seemed a little too intense. I was starting to get annoyed. Ryan and I were having a good time, and now this guy just shows up and starts acting like we're supposed to be entertaining him. As they kept talking, I could sense a shift in the conversation. Ryan wasn't laughing or joking anymore. He was quiet, listening more than speaking, his eyes darting around like he was worried. I tried to keep the conversation light, but it felt forced. The guy kept looking at me, sizing me up, and I felt like I was suddenly the subject of some kind of strange interrogation. After a few minutes, the man turned his attention back to Ryan, his tone dropping to something low and serious. They started whispering to each other, and it felt like I was no longer part of the conversation at all. Ryan's eyes were darting back and forth between the guy and me, and I could see his discomfort written all over his face. I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to make small talk with the guy, but he wasn't interested in my answers. He kept glancing at Ryan, then back at me like he was checking something off a mental list. It was beyond awkward. My heart was racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew this wasn't just a casual hangout anymore. Then things got even weirder. The man's questions got more personal, way more personal. He asked about where I grew up, if I had any family in town, and how long I'd known Ryan. He seemed to know a lot about me, more than I was comfortable with. I hadn't told either of them anything about my family or where I lived. Finally, Ryan spoke up, his voice tense. "Can we talk about this later?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He leaned in a little closer to Ryan, his voice low. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it felt like something important was happening. I was starting to feel like I wasn't supposed to be here, like I was part of something I didn't understand. I decided I had enough of this weird vibe. I grabbed my purse and stood up, announcing that I was heading home. Ryan didn't try to stop me, but the look he gave me wasn't the same as the easygoing guy I'd been talking to all night. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't place, like he was conflicted but also relieved. The man, on the other hand, didn't even acknowledge me leaving. He just kept talking to Ryan, their conversation growing more heated. I didn't wait around to find out what that was about. I just left, my heart pounding in my chest. On my way out of the bar, I pulled up my phone and texted my friend. Something was off tonight. Not sure what, but I feel weird about the whole thing. I didn't hear from Ryan for a few days after that. I wasn't sure what happened, but I didn't reach out either. I had this nagging feeling that I'd just been part of something shady, something I wasn't meant to be a part of. Then, on the fourth day, I got a message from Ryan. It was a simple, "Hey, how's everything?" which struck me as odd considering the situation. I didn't respond, and that was the end of it. I have no idea who that guy was or what they were talking about, but I'm not about to find out. Something about that whole night just didn't sit right with me, and I've had enough weird encounters to know when to trust my instincts. We started texting, and after a few weeks of back and forth, we decided it was time to meet in person. He seemed like a cool guy, laid back, easy to talk to, and he always had something funny to say. Our conversations were casual, but as time went on, I started looking forward to them more and more. We both shared an interest in hiking and outdoor activities, so when he suggested we meet up for a late night walk in the park, it didn't seem all that strange. At first, I was hesitant. Midnight felt like an odd time to be out, but he assured me it would be quiet and peaceful, just the way we liked it. We agreed on a public park near my place, where I walked through often. It was a place that felt safe and familiar to me, so I figured it would be fine. I figured we'd walk around a bit, talk, maybe sit on a bench, and just enjoy the night. Nothing major. When I showed up, Jake was already there, leaning against the tree by the entrance of the park. The park was nearly empty, which was what I expected at that hour. It was one of those places that felt peaceful, but also slightly eerie in the quiet of the night. The moonlight was the only light we had, and it made everything feel a little more surreal. Jake greeted me with a smile, and for the first few minutes, things were fine. We talked about random stuff, work, travel, favorite music, just the usual getting to know you stuff. But as we walked deeper into the park, I noticed something was a little off. Jake kept glancing around as if he was looking for something. It didn't seem too strange at first. Maybe he was just being cautious about being out at night. But the longer we walked, the more unsettled I started to feel. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I glanced at him, he had this weird, distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't really paying attention to me anymore. He kept looking off into the shadows, frowning to himself as if he was hearing something I couldn't. At one point, I asked him what was going on. I was starting to get genuinely uncomfortable, and I didn't know if it was just my nerves or if something was really off. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Oh, nothing. Just hearing some voices, that's all. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kept walking. He had a strange way of brushing things off that made me second-guess myself. Should I be worried? Was this just his way of being quirky, or was I reading too much into it? I couldn't figure it out, but the feeling of unease kept growing. We walked deeper into the park, into the section where it was a lot darker, away from the streetlights. The area was mostly wooded with just a few benches and winding paths. Then, out of nowhere, Jake stopped walking. He just froze in place, staring ahead into the pitch-black darkness of the trees. I stopped too, wondering if something had happened. Maybe he'd seen an animal or heard something. But as I stood there trying to figure out what was going on, he pulled out his phone and started filming me. It felt like a joke at first. He was probably just messing around, right? But when I saw the way he was holding his phone steady, like he was seriously recording, I realized it wasn't a joke. I tried to laugh it off. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. Instead, he asked me to act natural, but his voice was flat, almost mechanical. The way he was staring at me through the lens made my skin crawl. He didn't smile. He didn't seem like the guy I'd been texting for weeks. I tried to take a step back. "Jake, what's going on?" He didn't respond, and that's when I realized he wasn't just filming me casually. His questions started getting more invasive. He asked about my childhood, my family, things I hadn't told him. Things I hadn't even thought about in years. He knew too much. Way too much. He was asking specific questions, almost like he had already been tracking my life in some way. It clicked in my head, and suddenly, everything made sense. The odd way he'd always known things about me, the times he'd brought up details I hadn't shared. He had been looking into me long before we met. He wasn't just some guy I'd been talking to. He was stalking me, and I had been too trusting to notice. I wanted to scream to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. I tried to back away, but he kept blocking my path. He kept asking questions, and with each one, the air around us felt heavier, suffocating. I asked him to stop filming, to let me go, but he just stared at me through the lens like he was studying me. He didn't move. He wouldn't move. I realized that he wasn't just recording me. He was documenting something. Something about me. I turned to leave, my heart racing in my chest. He stepped in front of me, not aggressively, but firmly, and said, "I'm not done yet." I felt my panic rise, and I didn't care about looking calm or collected anymore. I shoved past him, running as fast as I could back toward the entrance of the park. I didn't even look back. I could hear him calling my name, but I didn't stop. I didn't care if I looked crazy. I didn't care if he saw me as rude. I just wanted out of that park. I kept running, not stopping until I reached the streetlights, and when I finally looked back, he was gone. I haven't heard from him since. I deleted everything, the texts, the number, the social media. I haven't been back to that park at night either. It's been a while now, but I still can't shake the feeling that he was watching me long before we met. I trusted him, and he was never the person I thought he was. Ryan was the type of guy you couldn't help but like. He was charismatic, funny, and had this easygoing energy about him. I'd met him on a dating app, and after a couple of weeks of chatting, we decided to grab drinks at a trendy bar downtown. The place was packed with a dim lighting and cool vibe, making it feel like one of those spots you go to just relax and unwind. He'd chosen the place, and I was excited to get out of the house for a night of fun. At first, everything seemed normal. We chatted about our favorite places to travel, shared stories about our work lives, and I was starting to feel like I could see myself hanging out with him more. He seemed genuine and totally easy to talk to. But as the night went on, something started to feel a little off. Rand kept checking his phone, glancing at it every few minutes like he was waiting for something. I thought maybe it was work stuff or maybe he was just distracted. But then he started excusing himself to take long phone calls, always walking away from the table, stepping out into the bar's courtyard to talk in private. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring he might just have a busy schedule, but the calls were always cryptic. I could hear snatches of his conversations when he was nearby, but it wasn't anything I could put together. Things like, yeah, I know. It's been taken care of, or we'll need to move quickly on this. It was the kind of stuff that made me wonder if he was involved in something more than just his usual 9 to 5 job. But I didn't want to assume anything. After all, we'd just met, and I didn't want to overthink things. Then, out of nowhere, a man walked into the bar. He wasn't someone I recognized, but when he approached Ryan, the change in his demeanor was noticeable. Ryan's usual confident, laid-back attitude faltered. His smile became more tense, and there was a moment of silence as they locked eyes. The guy walked up to the table, greeted Ryan with a nod, and sat down uninvited. I could tell Ryan wasn't happy about it. He looked uncomfortable, but he didn't ask the guy to leave. Instead, he introduced him as his friend, but there was something about the way he said it that didn't sit right with me. The man wasn't acting like someone just meeting a friend for drinks. His eyes were too sharp, his posture too rigid. It was like he was there on a mission. The moment he sat down, I felt the air in the room shift. Ryan's usual warm vibe turned cold. The man didn't acknowledge me at all. He just turned to Ryan, and they began whispering in low tones. I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but the way they spoke to each other, intense, almost conspiratorial, made my stomach turn. I tried to keep myself busy by filling with my drink, but I couldn't stop glancing at them. I didn't like the way they were looking at each other. It felt like I wasn't even there. The conversation wasn't casual. It felt more like some sort of deal or secret exchange. I wasn't sure if it was business, but whatever it was, it felt wrong. I could feel the tension growing between them, thick and uncomfortable. Eventually, the man stood up, gave Ryan a firm handshake, and walked out just as quickly as he'd appeared. The moment he left, Ryan immediately relaxed, but the shift in his behavior was hard to ignore. The warmth, the easygoing nature that he'd had earlier in the night was gone. He was suddenly distant, almost nervous, and I couldn't understand why. He didn't say much after that, just giving me short answers and avoiding eye contact. He started checking his phone even more, looking like he was waiting for another message or call. I tried to continue the conversation, but it was like pulling teeth. It was obvious that whatever had just happened had shaken him, and now I was just sitting there, trying to figure out what I had just witnessed. Was he involved in something shady? Was I part of something I didn't understand? I finished my drink, trying to stay calm, but I could feel my mind racing. Ryan was different now. The whole atmosphere had changed, and it didn't feel like a simple misunderstanding. Something about the way he had acted when that man showed up, the secrecy, the whispers, it all added up to something I didn't want to be a part of. I asked if he wanted to keep hanging out, but he seemed eager to wrap things up. He paid for the drinks, and we left the bar together, but the walk to the car was silent. We didn't even make eye contact. I could tell he was lost in thought, and the unease was palpable. When we got to my car, I felt like I needed to say something, anything, to break the tension. But before I could say anything, he suddenly turned to me and said, "I'll see you later, okay?" It was abrupt. I had no idea how to respond. I nodded, and before I could even get a word out, he turned and walked away, his back tense, his movements hurried. I drove home that night with my mind racing, trying to piece together what had happened. That man had shown up. Who was he? Why had Ryan acted so strange afterward? I had a gut feeling that whatever had gone down between them wasn't just about business or some casual friendship. And maybe, just maybe, I was never supposed to know. The next day, Ryan texted me, but it felt forced. He asked if I wanted to meet up again sometime, but it was clear he was distant now. He didn't mention the guy from the bar or anything that had happened. I didn't respond right away, unsure of how to handle the situation. I didn't text him back after that night. Something about the way he'd acted, the strange visitor, and the cryptic conversations made me feel like I was on the edge of something I shouldn't have seen. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been a part of something I wasn't meant to understand. I haven't heard from Ryan since. I deleted his number, and I don't think I'll ever go back to that bar again. We had similar interests, a love for outdoorsy activities, and both had a dry sense of humor. After a couple of weeks of chatting, we agreed to meet in person at a nice restaurant in the city. The date itself went as well as I could have hoped. Great food, easy conversation, and a lot of laughter. By the time we finished our meal, I was pretty sure I was going to ask her out again. When the night was winding down, she offered to give me a ride home, which I was fine with. It wasn't far, and I appreciated the gesture. As we walked to her car, I noticed she seemed a little off. She was quiet for a minute and then said she didn't feel comfortable walking to her apartment alone, so she asked if I could just come inside for a minute. I didn't think anything of it. I figured maybe she had some weird vibe, and honestly, she seemed pretty normal to me up until then. But when we got to her place, things got strange. She stopped right before the front door. I didn't know if she was nervous or what, but she seemed uneasy. She stared down the hallway of her apartment complex like she was expecting someone. I looked over my shoulder, trying to see if there was anyone behind us, but it was just a quiet hallway with a few other doors. Then, just as I was about to ask if everything was all right, I saw him. Standing at the end of the hall, almost hidden in the shadows, was a man. I couldn't make out much of his face, but he was staring directly at us. He was wearing a black hoodie, and it felt like his eyes were trained on me, even though I wasn't the one he should have been looking at. I turned back to Emily, but before I could say anything, she pushed the door open quickly without even looking at me, and almost rushed inside. It was like she didn't want me to see her too concerned. For a second, I hesitated, but I didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable, so I followed her in. I started to ask what was going on, but she was already walking into the apartment, clearly acting like nothing was wrong. I glanced back over my shoulder just in time to see the man step into the hallway. He looked like he was about to walk over to the door, and I instantly had this weird gut feeling that something wasn't right. Before I could process what was happening, Emily slammed the door shut behind me and I heard her lock it. A few seconds passed, and the tension in the room felt thick, so thick I could barely breathe. I tried to act casual, but my brain was firing off a million alarms. Emily finally turned to me, but I could tell she was rattled. She didn't meet my eyes, just stared at the floor. I wasn't sure if I should ask, but I did anyway. Who was that guy? She didn't answer at first. Then finally she sighed and muttered something I couldn't quite make out. When I asked her to repeat herself, she hesitated for a second before saying, That's my ex. I tried to process what she was saying, but before I could ask more questions, the door handle jiggled. And then there was a knock. Hard, angry knocking that sent a chill through me. My stomach dropped. I don't think you should be here, Emily said, her voice shaky. She stepped toward me, but I could see that her hands were trembling. Why is he here? I asked, my voice low, almost panicked. It didn't make sense. I don't know, she whispered. I told him I was done with him. I didn't think you'd come here tonight. The knocking continued, louder and more insistent now. I could feel the walls closing in. I didn't know what to do or how to get out of there without being noticed. And suddenly, the realization hit me. I was trapped in this tiny apartment, with no way of knowing what was going to happen next. Just as I was about to grab my phone to call for help, the door burst open. The dad was standing there, his eyes wild and desperate. He looked directly at Emily, then at me. The tension in the room snapped, and everything happened so fast I didn't have time to react. Emily stepped in front of me, and the guy shoved her aside. I froze, unsure whether I should try to run or stay calm. It felt like the whole world had shifted into chaos, but Emily's ex didn't seem to care about me at all. His eyes were locked onto her, and he began shouting at her, accusing her of lying, of trying to get away from him. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. But before I could even think of leaving, Emily stepped forward and shouted back. She pushed the guy out of the apartment, slamming the door behind her. For a second, I heard her and him shouting at each other outside, and I was left standing there, feeling completely frozen. Emily came back inside a few minutes later, her face pale. She told me it wasn't safe for me to stay, that he had a temper and that things could get worse. I didn't need any more convincing. I grabbed my things and left as quickly as I could. I haven't spoken to Emily since that night. I can't even bring myself to reach out to her. Part of me wonders if she knew the whole time that her ex was still watching her. Maybe she was just trying to get me involved in something I wasn't prepared for. All I know is I walked into a situation I should have avoided, and I barely made it out. I met Jake on a dating app, and things seemed to click right away. We texted for a few weeks before we agreed to meet in person, and when we finally did, I was excited. We met at a local coffee shop, and it felt comfortable from the start. Nothing awkward, just two people chatting and enjoying a cup of coffee. We talked about our favorite bands, movies, random stuff, and laugh over stupid things. I had a good feeling about him. By the end of the date, Jake offered to drive me home. I didn't think much of it. He seemed like a nice guy, and it's not like it was far from where we were. I'm not one to make a big deal about rides home, so I said sure. At first, everything was fine. He was chatty, telling me about his week, cracking jokes. But then, out of nowhere, he took a turn off the main road. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured maybe he knew a shortcut or something, so I kept quiet. But when we kept going, I started to get a weird feeling. The neighborhood started to change. The streets got quieter. The houses, which had been there before, disappeared, replaced by empty lots and rundown buildings. Where are we going? I finally asked, feeling the nerves creep in. Jake just smiled, not really answering. A shortcut. I wasn't sure what that meant, but it was definitely not where I thought we were heading. He kept driving, and the further we went, the more deserted the streets became. I could see the trees get denser, the streetlights fewer. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. I could feel my heart rate pick up, but I tried to stay calm. Jake, are you sure this is the right way? I asked again, trying to make my voice sound casual. Jake didn't seem fazed at all. He was still smiling and humming along to the music, completely oblivious to the fact that I was getting increasingly uncomfortable. The thing is, at that point, I started thinking about my options. I could ask him to turn around, but I had no idea where we were, and I didn't know if he would even listen. I could see the road winding around in front of us with nothing but woods and an occasional shack in sight. It was starting to feel less like a pleasant drive home and more like a setup for something bad. Hey, Jake, I don't feel too good about this, I said, trying to be direct but also trying to keep it cool. But instead of acknowledging me, he started talking about his exes. He started talking about how they never understood him, how they were all crazy, and how he was just trying to find someone who got him. I wasn't sure why he was bringing this up now, but it felt like a strange shift in conversation. The more he talked, the more intense he became. The way his voice dropped when he talked about them made me feel uneasy. I wanted to ask him to stop the car. I needed him to stop the car. But at the same time, I didn't know what I was dealing with here. Was this just an awkward, long-winded conversation, or was he about to pull some weird stunt? As we drove deeper into this empty area, I asked again, Jake, can you just drop me off now? He didn't seem to hear me, or if he did, he didn't care. He just kept driving. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped in the car, isolated with no one around. No stores, no houses, no lights, nothing. I didn't recognize anything. I couldn't even tell if the roads were safe or if we were heading in the right direction. The more he kept talking, the more I realized I needed to get out of this situation. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I told him I really don't feel comfortable with this. Please just let me out. I could feel the tension in the air as he took a sharp turn onto an even darker street. The headlights illuminated a rundown gas station far off in the distance, but that was it. The place looked abandoned. Jake didn't even seem to notice. When we reached the stop sign at the end of the street, I said it again, more urgently. Jake, I need you to pull over. Now. This time, he finally looked at me, but his smile was different. It wasn't the easygoing smile I had seen earlier. It was almost predatory. He stopped the car abruptly. I wasn't sure if he was trying to get a rise out of me or just being weird, but I knew I had to act fast. Come on, just a little while longer, he said, his voice more serious now, almost like a demand. I want to talk about this. What happened with me and my exes. No, I'm done, I said firmly, reaching for the door handle. He didn't stop me. He just sat there, watching me as I opened the door and stepped out, making sure I didn't trip or fall in the dark. I didn't care. I wasn't staying in that car another second. I walked away quickly, keeping my head low and not looking back. I knew I had to get to the nearest light, the nearest place where there were other people. Eventually, I found my way to a convenience store. I didn't have a clue where I was, but I didn't care. I didn't feel safe until I was inside. And by the time I got back home, I didn't even text Jake back. I didn't want to deal with him anymore. To this day, I don't know what his deal was or why he acted the way he did. I still feel weird about the whole situation. It's been a few months, and I can't shake the feeling that he was trying to lure me into something or test me, but I'm just glad I got out of there. I'll never ignore my gut instincts again. I met Ava on a quiet Friday night at a bar downtown. It was one of those places that had dim lighting and an ambient vibe, where the conversations flow and you forget you're even in a crowded place. I had been chatting with her on a dating app for about a week, and honestly, I was looking forward to meeting her in person. Her profile had pictures of her hiking, hanging out with friends, and enjoying quiet moments, things I liked too. It felt like we were a good match. When I first saw her, she was sitting at the bar, sipping on a drink. She smiled at me when I walked in, and it was like an instant connection. We started talking about everything: the music we liked, our favorite books, our experiences growing up, and our ambitions. There was laughter, ease, and a sense that we were both genuinely enjoying each other's company. After a couple of drinks, she suggested we go back to her apartment for more drinks and to listen to some music. It seemed like a natural next step. I had a good vibe about her. I thought it would be a perfect way to cap off the night. The drive to her place wasn't far. She lived in a nice, quiet neighborhood away from the hustle and bustle of the city. When we arrived, she seemed a little jittery. Nothing too noticeable, but enough for me to catch it. She fumbled a bit with the keys as she unlocked the door. I didn't think much of it at the time. Nervousness on a first date was normal. Maybe she just wanted everything to go smoothly. As she opened the door to let me in, I noticed nothing unusual at first. The apartment had a cozy feel, well decorated with soft lighting. The living room was neat, with a few plants scattered around. It looked like the kind of place I'd expect someone who was into minimalism and comfort to live in. Eva told me to make myself comfortable as she went into the kitchen to grab a drink. I followed her, but as I stepped into the kitchen, I noticed something odd. There was a lock on the window above the sink. I paused for a second, wondering why anyone would lock a kitchen window. It wasn't like it was on the ground floor or anything. It was high up and didn't seem like it would be an entry point for anyone. I turned to ask her about it, but then I heard a faint scraping noise from behind me. I didn't recognize it at first. It was almost like someone dragging something across the floor. I spun around quickly, and that's when I saw Eva standing in the doorway of the kitchen, holding a large kitchen knife. Her eyes weren't the same as before. They were cold, and there was no warmth or humor behind them anymore. She held the knife in her hand like she was ready to use it, and there was something unsettling about the way she stared at me. I couldn't breathe for a second. She didn't say anything immediately. Instead, she just watched me, almost like she was studying my every move. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears as I wondered if she was serious. Finally, she spoke, but her words were chilling. "I wasn't sure you'd make it out if I didn't do this," she said, almost as if it were a statement of fact, not a threat. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I had no idea what was going on or why she was acting this way. We had a perfectly normal time just an hour ago. I couldn't process what she was saying, but my instincts kicked in. Without thinking, I bolted toward the door. My mind was in overdrive. I didn't look back, just ran straight out of her apartment. I could hear her behind me, but I didn't care. I pushed the door open, sprinted down the hallway, and didn't stop until I was outside of the street. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest convenience store, where I stood outside, breathing heavily. My heart was racing. I looked around, trying to calm myself, but everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I hadn't even realized it, but I left my jacket in her apartment. I didn't care. I could go back for it later, but at that moment, all I wanted was to put as much distance between myself and that woman as possible. I spent the next hour just sitting there trying to get my bearings. My mind was racing. What had just happened? Why had she pulled a knife on me? Was she always like that, or was this a one-time thing? I kept replaying the night in my head, but nothing made sense. Everything had seemed fine at first. She had been normal, sweet, and engaging. What was that lock on the kitchen window about? Had she planned this from the beginning? I thought about calling the cops, but what would I even say? How could I explain the situation without sounding crazy? I barely had any answers to give. I didn't want to make a scene if I couldn't even explain what had happened. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. There was no way this was just a bad date. I had narrowly escaped something much darker. When I finally left the store, I went straight home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My phone kept buzzing with notifications, but I didn't have the energy to check them. I didn't want to know if Ava was trying to reach out to explain or apologize. I wasn't ready to hear any of it. The whole night felt like a bad dream, but when I woke up the next morning, the reality of it hit me harder than I could have expected. I still couldn't stop thinking about that knife and her words. What if I hadn't run? Would I have been another victim of something far worse? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. There was something seriously wrong with Ava, and I had barely escaped. I never heard from her again. No texts, no calls, nothing. I blocked her number, deleted her profile, and tried to forget the whole night. But the image of her standing there with that knife, watching me, stayed with me. I still think about her sometimes. I still wonder if there are others. I'll never forget what happened that night, and I'll never forget how close I came to being part of something I wasn't meant to understand. I have been chatting with Sophie on a dating app for about a month, and from our conversations, I thought we had a lot in common. She was witty, funny, and seemed down to earth. We had exchanged countless messages about movies, travel, food, and everything in between. The chemistry we had online was amazing, so I was really looking forward to meeting her in person. After a few weeks of texting, we agreed to meet at a local bar for our first date. The bar had a cozy vibe, low lights, quiet music, and a relaxed atmosphere. I was feeling optimistic, and when I walked in, I immediately spotted her at a table by the window. She looked different than her pictures, but not in a bad way. Her hair was shorter, and she had a big sweater that made her look more casual than her profile photos had suggested. But that wasn't what threw me off. When I sat down, we started talking, and right away, I noticed something wasn't quite right. Sophie wasn't acting like the person I'd been texting. At first, I thought it was just nerves, but as the conversation went on, it became clear that something was really off. She kept asking me questions I had already answered. I talked about my job and hobbies multiple times in our texts, but she was asking about them again. I figured maybe she just had a bad memory or was distracted. But then she started getting the details wrong. For example, I had told her I loved hiking and traveling, but she seemed confused when I brought it up. She looked at me like I was speaking a different language and said, "You love to travel." I didn't know that. I started to get the sense that Sophie wasn't the person I'd been talking to for weeks, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe she was just nervous, or maybe I was overthinking things. I tried to brush it off and continued chatting. But the more we talked, the more confused I became. Her answers to basic questions didn't line up with what she told me online. She kept asking me about stuff I had already shared in our previous conversations. I tried to keep the conversation flowing, but every time she spoke, I felt like she was a stranger sitting across from me. She wasn't the Sophie I'd been chatting with. But it wasn't until the conversation took an even stranger turn that I realized just how weird things were getting. She started talking about random past relationships. Nothing specific, just vague mentions of exes who didn't understand her, and how her last relationship had ended on bad terms. As she spoke, she seemed so disconnected from the topic, almost robotic. She wasn't telling me anything personal or engaging, just vague statements about things that didn't add up. It was like she was reciting a script instead of having a real conversation. That's when it hit me. Sophie wasn't Sophie. She didn't even seem to know who Sophie was. There was something off about her. I started to feel an unsettling pit in my stomach, and my mind raced, trying to piece things together. I couldn't figure out if I was being pranked or if something more sinister was going on. I decided to cut the night short and leave. I had to get out of there. I excused myself and told her I wasn't feeling well. But as I stood up to leave, she didn't seem upset or concerned. She just smiled and said, "Okay, we'll see you again soon." It wasn't a goodbye, it was more like a casual observation. But it didn't sit right with me. It felt almost rehearsed. I didn't want to make a scene, so I paid for my drink and walked out. But the weirdness didn't end there. As I left the bar, I glanced over my shoulder, and I saw her standing at the window watching me. She didn't move, just stared. It was like she was waiting for something. I kept walking, my heart racing, not wanting to look back. As soon as I got outside, I pulled out my phone to check if there were any messages from her, but there was nothing. No texts, no calls, just silence. I tried to push it all out of my mind, but as the night went on, I couldn't stop thinking about her behavior. I checked her profile again and noticed a few things I hadn't before, like how there were no other pictures of her besides the ones she had posted, and there were no mutual friends. I told myself I was just overthinking things. I had a few bad dates before, so I figured this was just another weird encounter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just met someone who wasn't who they claimed to be. There was a strange emptiness about her, like she was wearing someone else's skin. I didn't hear from her the next day or the day after that. I didn't reach out either. I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. I started to wonder if I had just been part of some weird experiment or if I had unknowingly stepped into something dangerous. Maybe she was stalking me, or maybe I had been talking to someone else entirely, a different person pretending to be Sophie. The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. I had been chatting with this person for weeks, but nothing about our date felt real. I didn't even know if Sophie was the real person or just an identity someone had invented for whatever reason. Was she playing a game or was something more twisted going on? A week later, I got a text from her, just one message. It said, "Hey, I think we should meet again. I need to talk to you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I wasn't sure what I would even say. I never met with her again. I blocked her number and deleted her contact. That weird feeling never went away, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd gotten caught up in something I didn't fully understand. Her pictures were beautiful, but it was her bio that really caught my attention. She seemed so intelligent, funny, and had a great taste in music. It didn't take long before we decided to meet in person. We agreed on a cafe in the city, one I'd been to a few times, so I felt comfortable with the location. When I first saw her, I was immediately struck by how different she looked in person compared to her pictures. She looked even better, if that was possible. Tall, with striking eyes and a warm smile. We shook hands, and she seemed friendly, relaxed, and easy to talk to. We sat down and started chatting about everything from our favorite books to childhood memories, and the conversation flowed smoothly. But something felt off. It wasn't that Emily was weird, but there was this underlying tension I couldn't quite shake. It was like I was talking to someone who was hiding something, though I couldn't figure out what. Maybe it was just nerves, I told myself. It was our first date after all. But I kept getting this weird feeling that I was being watched, or that something wasn't entirely right. We talked for a while, but as the evening went on, things started to feel a little too intimate. Emily asked a lot of personal questions, things that were more probing than I was used to on a first date. I didn't mind sharing details about my life, but the questions kept coming and they started getting more specific. She asked about my family, about my past relationships, about my fears, and about things I'd never even told my closest friends. The weirdest part was how she seemed to remember everything I said. If I mentioned something casually, she would bring it up again later, almost as if she had a mental checklist of everything I said. I started to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to keep the conversation going. But I noticed something even stranger. Every time I looked away or checked the time, she seemed to be staring at me, watching me in a way that wasn't casual. It was as if she was studying me. I would catch her glancing at me with this almost intense look, like she was trying to figure me out. It sent chills down my spine, but I didn't say anything. I figured maybe I was just overthinking things. As the night wore on, she suggested we take a walk nearby to continue the conversation. The cafe was located near a park, so we headed in that direction. It was a little quieter there, which would have been fine if it weren't for the strange feeling that followed me. Emily's tone had changed too. She sounded less like someone on a first date, and more like someone trying to manipulate a conversation. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something was definitely off. We walked through the park, the darkness creeping in as the sun set. At one point, she stopped abruptly, staring off into the distance, lost in thought. I asked her if she was okay, but she didn't respond right away. She just stood there, looking at the darkened trees and the shadows creeping across the path. I waited, not knowing what to say. It was like she was in some kind of trance. After a few long moments, she turned to me, her eyes wide, but with a strange, almost eerie calmness. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. I wasn't sure how to respond. It was such an odd question, especially at this time of night. But before I could say anything, she began talking about her past, her family, her childhood. She spoke about how she always felt like she was meant to be alone, and how people would always leave her. Her words were starting to feel more like a confessional than a conversation. I didn't know how to react, but I just nodded, trying to be understanding, though I felt more and more uncomfortable. We kept walking, but the conversation turned darker. Emily started talking about disappearing and how she had been thinking a lot about how easy it would be to just vanish from her life, start fresh, and never look back. The more she talked, the more her words seemed disconnected from reality. It was almost like she was speaking in riddles, like she wasn't entirely there with me. Then she suddenly stopped and looked me dead in the eyes. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper again. "Do you ever feel like someone is watching you, even when they're not?" Before I could answer, I heard footsteps behind me, the sound of someone approaching from a distance. I glanced back, but there was no one there. I turned to Emily, and she was staring ahead, unblinking. The tension between us grew thicker. It was like we were in our own little world, and I wasn't sure if I was welcome anymore. Then she took a step toward me, reaching out like she was going to touch my arm. I instinctively took a step back, and in that moment, everything changed. Her expression shifted from that eerie calm to something more intense, almost desperate. It was like she had been trying to hold something in and now it was about to break. "I have to go," I said quickly, my voice shaky. I wasn't even sure if I was saying it to her or to myself. I couldn't explain why, but the fear was almost palpable now. I needed to get away from her. Emily didn't react. She just stood there, watching me, as I turned and started walking quickly back to the exit of the park. I didn't look back. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew she was watching me, knew that something was terribly wrong. I finally reached the main road, where a taxi pulled up just in time for me to jump inside. I told the driver my address, not saying a word more. I was shaken, my mind racing with all the things I couldn't explain. Had I just experienced a meltdown, or was something deeper happening here? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something worse than just a bad date. The next day, I checked my phone and saw a text from Emily. It was simple, just a single sentence. "I guess we were meant to meet, but I never thought it would end like this." I didn't respond. I blocked her number, deleted her contact, and made a promise to myself to never go on another first date without listening to my gut feelings. Whenever that night was, it was more than I wanted to understand. I was looking forward to it, despite feeling a little nervous. The whole first date thing is always a bit strange, you know. When I first saw her, I was a little taken aback. Donna was even more beautiful than her pictures, tall, with dark hair that framed her face perfectly, and a smile that seemed to light up the room. We exchanged pleasantries, and I could tell she was nervous too, which made me feel a bit better. We sat down and started chatting, and it felt easy at first. We talked about our jobs, music, movies. We even laughed about some of the ridiculous messages we'd gotten on the app. Donna seemed like someone I could get along with, and the conversation flowed smoothly. But then something started to feel off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. She was very intense in a way that I hadn't expected. Every time I said something, she would stare at me like she was studying me, processing every word with a level of focus that made me uncomfortable. Her eyes were wide, and she seemed almost too interested in what I was saying. I brushed it off at first, thinking I was just being paranoid. But then she started asking questions that seemed a little too personal. Like, I mentioned a trip I had planned with some friends, and she immediately wanted to know exactly who was going, where we were staying, and how long we'd be there. It was a little strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I answered her questions, thinking maybe she was just being friendly and wanted to learn more about me. But as the night went on, the questions got stranger. Dawn asked about my childhood, my family, my relationship with my parents. Things I had only discussed with close friends, not a person I just met. I started feeling like she was digging deeper than someone normally would on a first date. I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction, but no matter what I said, she always found a way to loop it back to something more personal. At one point, she asked me about my exes, and then she seemed to get oddly quiet when I answered. She didn't smile or laugh. It was like she was waiting for me to say something. Then she did something that made my skin crawl. As I was talking about my work, she slid a little notebook out of her bag and started writing down something I had just said. I didn't know why, but the whole thing felt wrong. I tried to lighten the mood by asking if she was taking notes on me, but she didn't respond. She just kept writing. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to make sense of the situation. Donna finally looked up at me and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I just like to keep track of things," she said softly. I laughed it off, thinking maybe I was overthinking things. But deep down, something was bothering me. My gut was telling me that this wasn't normal. She wasn't just a little quirky, she was hiding something, and I had no idea what it was. By the time the evening was wrapping up, I was feeling uneasy enough that I decided to leave. Donna seemed like she was in no rush to end the night, though. She kept talking, and I kept nodding along, trying to be polite, but also looking for an out. When the check came, I paid quickly, hoping that would signal the end of the evening. But Donna didn't seem to take the hint. She suggested we take a walk in the nearby park before I headed home. I hesitated, but she was so hopeful that I couldn't say no. We walked through the park, and the whole time she kept talking. At first, it was about the book she was reading, but then she started asking more personal questions again. The questions started feeling like they were meant to pry into my life to find things I wasn't ready to share. Eventually, we reached a bench near a small pond, and Donna stopped walking. She turned to me with a strange look in her eyes. You know, she said, I always find it fascinating how people hold on to their pasts, how much of it shapes them, whether they realize it or not. I didn't know how to respond. I was starting to feel like I was being interrogated, not dating. She took another step closer, and I could feel the space between us closing in. I wasn't sure if it was intentional or if she just didn't pick up on how uncomfortable I was, but the whole situation felt suffocating. Sometimes it's better to leave the past behind, she said cryptically. I forced a smile. Yeah, I guess so. Then, without warning, Donna reached into her bag and pulled out a small photo album. She opened it to a page, and there was a picture of me, taken from behind, while I was walking down the street on my way to the cafe. I froze, the blood draining from my face. I had no idea how she had gotten that picture. I hadn't even seen her around when I walked to the cafe. You took this? I asked, my voice shaky. Donna didn't say anything at first. She just smiled, and it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was a smile that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I like to remember things, to make sure they're never forgotten, she said softly, as if it were completely normal. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even care about being polite anymore. I needed to get out of there. I think it's time for me to go. Donna didn't try to stop me. She just watched me leave, her eyes following me as I walked away. I didn't look back until I reached the street, and even then I could feel her watching me. I quickly hailed a cab and left. The image of that photo burned into my mind. How long had she been watching me? How much did she know about me? I haven't heard from Donna since that night, and I didn't plan on ever reaching out again. It might seem dramatic, but something about her made me feel like I was in danger. Maybe it was her intense curiosity, or maybe it was the fact that she had been following me without me knowing. Either way, I knew I had to get away from her as fast as I could. And every time I go out now, I always make sure to check my surroundings, just in case someone's watching from the shadows.